To this year's Candidates Forum. My name is Liz Medicine Crow. I'm Pinkett and Haida from Cake, Alaska, and I'll be serving as the timekeeper this year. To our candidates, just to let you know how we're going to do the timekeeping. I will be beating the drum when your time is up, and I will not stop, and I will get louder. And one of the things that we as Native peoples have as one of our most powerful tools is the drum. And so we respect it, and we ask you to also show that respect so that we can continue to move forward in the forum in a timely manner. And to the crowd, our other instruction for the crowd is that there's a policy of no heckling, and any of the hecklers that are out there who can't resist that moment and the opportunity, just know that it will be your last heckle because you will be escorted out of the building. Okay? We can agree to that? Okay, so let's begin. Time is of the essence in this forum. We want to thank and say Gunesh Chish to the candidates for their time. Lisa Murkowski is the first Alaska-grown U.S. Senator. She was born in Ketchikan 2 years before statehood and raised in Wrangell, Juneau, Fairbanks, and Anchorage. She has served in the Senate since 2002. Before running for the Senate, Joe Miller worked as an attorney in private general practice, a local government attorney, and a U.S. magistrate judge assisting the Alaska Federal District Court with its caseload. Lieutenant Colonel Margaret Stock is an immigration attorney based in Anchorage, Alaska. Ray METCALFE is a politician and political activist. He has served in the Alaska House of Representatives and operates METCALFE Real Estate Company. And with that, we will begin.
So good afternoon. My name is Richard Peterson. I have the first question. Tribal consultation is vital to our tribal and federal government relations. What is your understanding of tribal consultation, and what will you do to ensure it is effectively used by federal agencies? Mr. Miller, will you start, and then we'll move down the line to your left?
Well, I don't think that tribal consultation means that you just sit at the table and you agree to whatever the federal government dictates. I believe that it requires that there's an acknowledgement that tribes are sovereign. Most of you may know that I'm a constitutionalist. Article 1, Section 8 establishes tribal sovereignty, and they have to be recognized as such. You have to be recognized as not just being somebody that is dictated to cooperate, but somebody that actually is a decision maker. Your history, your understanding of the needs of Alaska, particularly rural Alaska, should take a superior position to those in DC. So often what we have in this state is DC values being imposed upon Alaska, particularly rural Alaska, and that is not the way forward. It's time for us as Alaskans, especially those Alaska natives that have superior knowledge of the needs, particularly in rural Alaska, to be in a decision-making position and not simply given a seat at the table. It has to be real concrete decision-making and the respect afforded you as a sovereign.
Thank you.
Lisa?
Consultation needs to be more than just a check-the-box exercise, and unfortunately, that's what we see all too often. I hear such inconsistency as I talk to so many of you with frustrations coming out of the consultation process. We actually had the head of BLM, Director Cornsey, ask me, what do you think consultation is? This is the head of one of our federal agencies. So making sure that consultation is clear, is concise, and is meaningful has got to be a priority. But this cannot be the agency or the administration telling you what consultation is. Recently, HUD came down with their consultation process, and they asked for comment. But it was them telling you what consultation should be. That's exactly the wrong way to approach it. You need to be the ones that tell the federal agencies what meaningful, clear, and concise consultation truly is. So we need to be working on this. We want to identify some best practices. I'm going to ask the GAO to do exactly that, because right now there is no consistency, and the clear, meaningful, and concise is not in place.
I will tell you that local control is the key to encouraging federal and state consultation and sovereignty for the villages and the tribes. And I think sovereignty will bring them to the table, and I think sovereignty will go an awful long ways to encouraging federal and state authorities to consulting when it's appropriate and consulting when you have a stake in the issue that's being considered. So sovereignty, I think, is 90% of the solution.
Consultation to me means respecting tribal sovereignty and respecting tribes as what they are, governments. It means government to government consultation, not just symbolic gestures. The United States began its future with the saying, "No taxation without representation," and consultation should mean no decisions being made without representation.
Medicaid expansion provides coverage for 40,000 more Alaskans. Of those, 16,000 are Alaska Native. How do you feel about the Affordable Care Act's impacts to this state? And we'll start with Margaret Stock and then move down the line.
I believe that the Affordable Care Act has been very helpful to Alaska. It's expanded insurance coverage for thousands of Alaskans. I don't support repeal of the Affordable Care Act, replacing it with nothing. We need to fix it, but we do need to get the costs under control. With that in mind, I support improvements to the Affordable Care Act that would allow more Alaskans to have medical coverage, with our goal that all Alaskans should have access to affordable medical care. I support measures that would allow the Affordable Care Act to get a handle on the costs. This has been a problem. We need to move towards a single-payer system. We're not there yet, but many Alaskans already have access to what is in effect a single-payer system. And we know that these attempts to provide insurance solely through the private marketplace do not work. We need to empower the federal government to negotiate costs on behalf of all of Americans, not just the few and the privileged. I support, again, improvements to the Affordable Care Act. I do not support repealing it and replacing it with nothing.
In the lead up to the presidential races, you all heard Bernie Sanders' comments on single payer, medical, Medicare expansion. I am 100% in agreement with Bernie Sanders' proposed approach. I want to see every single American have ready access to the medical care they need, no exceptions at all. And I think it's time to do exactly what he was recommending, get the insurance companies out of the picture and come up with a single payer program. Thank you.
With passage of the Affordable Care Act, we saw some positives. I think the opportunity for expanded coverage here in the state of Alaska with Medicaid expansion was something that clearly has provided for coverage for more. Contained within the ACA as a separate add-on was a measure that I had been working on for years, the Indian Healthcare Improvement Act. That is one of the good solids, most clearly. There are some provisions within the ACA that I think we would all recognize are good and helpful, allowing coverage for those up to the age of 26, coverage for those with pre-existing conditions. But when you're asking people across the state of Alaska whether or not they think the Affordable Care Act is affordable, they will tell you no. They will say that they have not seen the benefit to their families. We were in Kodiak last week talking with families, fishing families, that are looking at premiums in the tens of thousands of dollars a year with deductibles of $9,000 to $10,000, absolutely unaffordable, unsustainable. The Affordable Care Act did nothing to reduce the cost of care, the driver that we have seen that is bringing so many of our families to their knees economically. We must do more when it comes to reducing the cost of health care in this country, and we didn't do it with the ACA.
So I'm not a fan of Obamacare. I think it's done more damage than it's done good. And the senator did rightly point out that, in fact, there are many people across this state that have increased premiums, substantially increased premiums, and substantially increased deductibles. But when we spend more money, especially when we look at IHS, which is underfunded, and I think less than 60% of its target budget, I would think that the government, which is under crushing debt, we're now at $20 trillion. I mean, just an enormous amount. And back in 2010, when I ran for office, I mentioned that it didn't matter who you elected, those federal funds would shrink. And in fact, they have. It's an ever-diminishing pool of federal money. So the decisions that we make have to be smart. They have to be directed toward, for example, market-based solutions where we can. For example, allowing choice to those that are part of government-mandated health plans, where they can actually select who their providers are, where you can actually have the person that's making the medical decisions in the driver's seat, deciding based upon a cost-benefit analysis as to what's best for them, rather than having government mandates. One of the problems with Obamacare is it's a mechanism by which government wants more control over you, wants more information about you. They send, for example, your medical records to a clearinghouse where, guess what? The federal government maintains control of all those records. I don't know how many of you like that concept. I certainly don't, especially with the hacking attempt that occurred today. The fact is, none of those records are secure. And I happen to be, like many of you, zealously protective of our individual liberties. I think the more that we're in charge, the better it is for all of us. Thank you.
Good afternoon. My name is Sarah Obed. I work for Doyan Limited. I represent Doyan on government affairs. My question is this. For members of Congress and the Senate that don't know anything about Alaska Native corporations, how do you describe ANC impacts to our communities? And if Mr. Metcalfe, if you can start this question and then we'll circle around.
I was born on the Crow Reservation in Montana. That's where I lived my first 15 years of my life. That's where my parents passed away. When I was a child, the majority of the food on our table came from something we raised, shot, or raised in the garden. And so I grew up in somewhat of a subsistence lifestyle myself. I understand reservations, I understand how they work, and I know the difference between corporations and reservations. I watched the corporations develop as I was in the legislature, and I can see the difference. You know, the corporations did things that the reservations didn't do in 145 years. The corporations did it in 45 easily. However, I am concerned that the wealth is not being properly spread, and but the ability to explain the difference between reservations and the qualities and the good things that have come from the corporations and why they are essential for Alaska's future. They are essential for Alaska's people to do well as society evolves. And so it's a marriage of importance to rural and non-rural Alaska. It's a marriage of importance to all the people of Alaska, that the corporations do well. And I think I'm in better position to explain the differences between reservations and corporations and why they need to recognize their needs and make sure they survive.
Sarah, I think you asked a very important question because it's one that we deal with back in Washington, D.C. We talk about Alaska Native corporations. And people in the lower 48 know what a corporation is. But an ANC is not a corporation like IBM. And so we need to truly change their heads around about what an ANC is. who they are responsible to, what is the duty and the obligation to the shareholder, because it's a different obligation than to a shareholder of IBM. For those of you in this room, think about how through the ANCs we provide the benefits to all shareholders. Any of you who have received an educational scholarship, whether for college or vocational opportunities, think about it. You raise your hand. For your families who may have received burial benefits through your ANC, raise your hand. If you've received a job through your ANC, this is what we need to explain to people who do not understand ANCs.
It's clear that a healthy Alaska is dependent on healthy ANCs, as it is dependent, of course, on healthy tribes as well. And we, if you choose to elect me or those that are elected to Washington, D.C., have to ensure that the ability of profit remains, that you can actually use the lands that you have in order to produce wealth. One of the things that's impressed me about the ANCs is their adaptability, the fact that the 8A contracts, for example, have been reduced, as I predicted they would be back in 2010. And many of the corporations have done quite well and still creating profit. Something that's very, very important, especially given the fact that now we suffered the loss of 50% of our permanent dividend fund this year. Of course, not all the corporations were able to pay dividends. Many were not. But the fact is, the more that we lose those things that we need, especially as rural Alaskans, to provide for ourselves, the more important it is for these other facets of our economy to be strong. I'm convinced that the Alaska Native corporations can continue to provide significant resources to the state. One of the things that's always impressed me is about how much of the money, how much of the revenue that comes into the ANCs comes in from outside of Alaska. And that, of course, is of significant benefit to all of us, not just those that are members of the corporations, but those of us who also reside here in Alaska. And so it's a big blessing that we have those, and I champion and, of course, also support their continued viability. And I think that Alaska's future will be bright as long as they stay healthy.
And in the interest of time, if we could hold the applause, please. Thank you.
If asked to explain what Alaska Native corporations are to senators and representatives who are unfamiliar with them, I would at first say that they are completely different from the average corporation that senators and congressmen in the lower 48 might be familiar with, because they are part of the federal government's unique trust responsibility to Alaska Natives. And they're a means by which Alaska Native communities can seek to come out of poverty, to promote economic development, and to provide jobs for shareholders. They are uniquely Alaskan the way Alaska is unique. I would try to explain to people that in the past, sometimes the federal government has sought to fulfill its trust responsibility by handing money directly to people rather than promoting their future welfare and well-being through economic development, jobs, education, and other more positive means. And the Alaska Native corporations do this. Rather than being a direct handout, the intent is to promote the future welfare of Alaska Native communities through the corporation. And the corporation provides extremely large benefits to the members and the shareholders who work within the corporation.
Thank you. Next, we are going to have a very brief yes or no question. So if you could just answer yes or no. If you go beyond that one word, you will hear the drum.
Love that drum.
So my question is, do you support funding of new icebreakers for the United States Coast Guard? Margaret? And
Yes.
then,
Absolutely.
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 thank you.
They copied me.
My question is, will you support a Supreme Court confirmation in the 2016 lame duck congressional session?
We'll start on that end this time. Mr. Miller?
No, he's anti-Second
No,
Amendment.
that's all. Yes or no?
It needs to be a confirmation process.
Lisa will be the lame duck.
Yes, right now.
Okay. Please.
My yes or no question is this. Will you support the passage of advanced appropriations of Indian Health Services funding?
Oh, we can start with Lisa.
Yes.
Ray?
Yes.
Margaret?
Yes.
Yes.
Thank you.
Yes.
What is your plan to ensure resource development in rural Alaska equitably benefits rural Alaskans? Mr. Metcalfe?
Repeat the question, please.
What is your plan to ensure resource development in rural Alaska equitably benefits rural Alaskans?
You know, I have spent years traveling around this state trying to explain to people the value of their resources that they're not getting. You know, over my shoulder here, I see a sign that says ExxonMobil on it. How many people know in this room know that Exxon has never produced a single barrel? They are simply getting checks from those companies that have the majority of the field, and they spent a few $1 million back in the 60s, and they acquired billions and billions and billions of dollars. We have never received what other countries receive from our resources. And knowing the value, understanding the value, our permanent fund would be about 5 times what it is today if we had simply gotten what it was worth and saved it. So would your dividend.
Lisa?
I think we recognize that so many of our native corporations are already involved in resource development projects out in our rural areas. We see indirect benefits for our rural Alaskans through employment there, and indirect benefits as well through dividends to shareholders that are important. But I think a recognition that the more that we can be doing to develop these partnerships and contracting opportunities does bring direct help and benefit to our rural areas. You know, we can't tell people where to do business, but we can ask the right questions and create an expectation that Native businesses are hired for the work, Alaska Natives are hired for these projects, and that not only the businesses stand to benefit and gain, but those in the region directly stand to benefit and gain.
I believe that if there is risk to the Native communities, the Alaska Native communities in which the resource development is occurring, there needs to be some form of profit sharing that reflects that risk. They live there, they suffer the risk, they definitely ought to share in the profit. But one of the things that really aggravates me, and I've lived here in Fairbanks since '02, many of you have probably seen this throughout the state, is that Washington, D.C. has allowed foreign workers to come into the state. I think that if we're going to have projects in Alaska, it ought to be Native hire. I just don't get it. Why are we importing thousands of foreign workers? Why not create an obligation, for example, of training for those that most in need of work? I was just in Stebbins and St. Michael several days ago, spent the night, and the unemployment rates are just unthinkable in many of these villages. And the seasonal work particularly, people would jump at the opportunity, but no, we're being displaced by other workers. I believe that the health of Alaska is dependent on the health of our rural communities. We got to think transformatively, though. If we keep on going the same way we've gone, you can pretty much expect the same results.
My plan would include strengthening and growing the 8A program, which is key to the economic health of many rural areas in Alaska and Alaska Native corporations. I also support the Indian Self-Determination and Educational Assistance Act, and I would work to expand that to include transportation projects, Department of Transportation projects. I believe that Congress should improve the revenue sharing on the Outer Continental Shelf rules. Right now, they direct a share of non-federal OCS oil revenues to Alaska Native entities. I would fix it to allow direction of non-federal OCS oil revenues to Alaska Native entities, and that was in Mark Begich's bill, but notably Senator Murkowski's bill does not allow for that. In terms of groundfish fisheries, I would expand the CDQ program to Aleutian Island, to Gulf of Alaska, and to other communities in Southeast Alaska. I would expand co-management programs like the Kuskokwim River Intertribal Fish Commission and the Yukon River Intertribal Fish Commission. I'm a strong supporter of co-management of our natural resources, and I think that would help develop rural Alaska much better. Basically, we need to take all available steps to ensure that federal dollars create total jobs and local communities benefit first and foremost from our natural resources.
Thank you. The next question is related to criminal justice reform. Alaska recently passed Senate Bill 91. Tell me your position when it comes to federal criminal justice reform. And we will start with Lisa Murkowski.
Thank you. There has been a considerable bipartisan effort in the United States Senate to evaluate, just as we did at the state level, the criminal justice reform and sentencing reform. It is an act that, or it is a draft legislation that had generated a great deal of support and discussion, and it was actually thought that we might be able to advance that before we adjourned in September. I think it is important to recognize that just as we see here in the state of Alaska, we have disparities amongst our minorities here in Alaska. The Alaska Native population that is incarcerated is extraordinarily disproportionate, and that led the effort to ultimately passage of SB 91. We must do more to make sure that those who are the victims are not incarcerated with no ability to really escape a system that is closed in upon them. So as we move forward with sentencing reform, criminal justice reform at the Senate level, I would anticipate that it would follow much of the discussions and the direction that was led here in Alaska just this past year.
Thank you. Mr. Metcalfe?
In reforming the criminal system, the first thing that's got to go is private prisons. Back a few years back, you may remember the VICO, where Bill Allen was jailed for his involvement in bribing our legislators. One of the bribes that one of the things he was involved in was private prisons. I'm the chairman of an organization which members of its board went out and collected the signatures to stop a private prison from going into Kenai. And the other things, and I'm very aware that there's a disproportionate number of Native Alaskans that are in prison. One of the things that I would like to see is every American and every Alaskan have the ability to vote. There should never be anybody losing their ability to vote for any reason. I believe it's a sacred right that should never be infringed. I don't care if somebody's in prison or a felon. They have the right to vote, and should they be given that right, there would be a constituency for people who are behind bars. There would be people voting who have experienced the injustices of our private prison, and people would have to pay a lot more attention to them. So I think that's part of the solution. I think the drug war was a disaster. Addiction is a medical issue, not a criminal issue. So those are my thoughts.
Ms. Stock.
It should be a national embarrassment that the United States has more people incarcerated than any other country in the world. It should also be an embarrassment that the federal government spends more money on incarceration than education. How do we put a stop to this? We need to invest more in education, and particularly education at an early age. There's an old saying, it comes from the Bible, from Proverbs: train the child in the way he should go, and when he is older, he will not depart from it. If we invest more and more money into early education, we can prevent mass incarceration later on. We also need to work on the issues and the ideas that were raised this morning on the panel on SB 91. The panel made it clear that they've looked at the data, they've studied this problem extensively, and the solution to problems with crime are not to simply put people in prison. We need to consider the whole family, the child's origins, the educational background, the family situation, and we need to move to alternative sentencing and treatment when there's no threat to public safety. We also need to seriously consider how substance abuse is impacting our communities, and we need to invest lots of money in substance abuse treatment, addiction treatment, and other medical solutions.
We are really trying to get back on schedule. So although we appreciate the applause, let's reserve applause as they answer questions. Thank you.
So the federal government is involved in far too much in the way of criminal law enforcement. The federal government should be restrained. It should not be involved in the drug wars. It's resulted in mass incarceration. Those are state issues that ought to be decided closer at home, as Alaska has. But that being said, I think that when we evaluate the criminal justice issues, I had the tremendous pleasure of being in Tok, Alaska for over 4 years as a state magistrate and address some really intractable problems of repeat offenders, the fact that we just weren't seeing what would work. And so I started the first rural therapeutic drug court in the state. And it was not done with government funding. It was done by looking at the communities, working with Tanacross, working with Tetland, working with Northway, working with UTAP, Upper Tanana Alcohol Program, and working with our local doctors to develop a program that actually addressed issues and did actually result in virtually no recidivism. Those are the type of programs that we need to look at to address the intractable issues, but really, fundamentally, what it boils down to is purpose. Are we going to provide purpose for people in the rural areas of the state? And purpose is provided in many different ways, but one of the ways, of course, is through jobs, by work. And those are things that we can create from the wealth of the land. The wealth of the land that we've just given rhetoric to in past generations, for 36 years effectively. That's what we've done. We've got to look a new direction.
Thank you. Again, just to keep us on time, the next 2 questions, if you can keep your answers to 1 minute. With the new administration coming into the White House, what action will you take to educate the new administration? And what is the top issue that you think the administration will need to understand about Alaska Native community? Oh,
Who begins?
Ms. Stock, actually that question is for you first.
The first thing I will do when the new administration comes in is meet with them, meet with their transition team before the administration takes office, and I will meet with the new agency nominees, White House staff, and bring them up to date, up to speed on Alaska Native community issues. There are an enormous number of issues that need to be brought to their attention, but the top 3 issues that I would bring to their attention would be the need to invest substantial resources into the Arctic. Second, I would bring to their attention the impacts of climate change on Alaska Native communities. And finally, I would talk to them about the importance of tribal organizations and how tribes and the Alaska Native corporations are changing the face of Alaska and the important role that they are playing and how the legal system is evolving accordingly.
Trying to explain Alaska to someone in Washington is a bit difficult. You'd have to make them come see it. It's a very learning experience when someone flies in a jet to Alaska, a twin engine or single engine plane out to the bush, and I had a sister who was she was the speech therapist for the Bethel School District, and she once in a while had to sit on a bag of mail to get into the villages she used to serve. It was a learning experience for her, and I think the most important things that you need to bring to their attention is that we were left out of when Roosevelt was in office. He brought together a program to build dams, electricity, and telephone service all through the Midwest. We weren't part of that. We didn't get the roads. We didn't get the sewer systems, the water systems. We were left out. That's what you need to make them understand.
Well, I agree with Ray that the best, most effective way to educate a new administration, a new cabinet, is to bring them here. There is no substitute for seeing it on the ground. And we can talk to them in our office. We can direct questions to them when they're going through a confirmation hearing. But true understanding comes when they are in the town. When I brought the Secretary of Energy out to Oscarville, population 80, it opened his eyes. But it's not just the administration. There will be new members of Congress who have not yet been to Alaska who also need to understand. So it's bringing them here to see, to listen, to understand what it is that, how we deal and who we are. Focusing with the Secretary of Interior on issues like Native affairs and subsistence. Focusing with the Secretary of Energy on the extraordinarily high cost of energy here in this state and what it means to our families. Talking to the Secretary of Treasury about new market tax credits. This is what we need to do.
I think it's very important for the administration to recognize how we live in rural Alaska. Spend a night in a village, especially one like Stebbins that doesn't have running water. See what it's like to actually lead a subsistence lifestyle. See what it's like to have third world conditions within the United States of America, despite the fact that we've been talking about it for decades, pulling us out of that morass. That's what they need to see. I think they need to understand the high energy cost. You know, those of us who've lived in the interior recognize the cost of energy, how it's a critical issue for us, especially those of us who are trying to make ends meet now with less than half our PFD. When we look at, for example, the infrastructure in Alaska and the costs that are associated with not having that. And then the strategic importance. And I want to dwell on that for just a minute. The strategic importance of Alaska, when we look at the shrinking federal purse, we know that the Defense Department, the needs that we have versus our strategic partners, or not so much partners like China and Russia sometimes, that is an area where Alaska can actually expand. Now we've got, what, a division of Russian troops at Chakata? It's time to be transformative.
It's hard to compete against the drum.
Do you support a rural subsistence priority or a native preference for subsistence on all Alaskan waters? How do you expect to improve the present federal state management system for subsistence hunting and fishing? Mr. Miller?
So I've always been surprised that we've got, what, about 44 million acres of Alaskan native land. And it seems to me that Alaskan natives ought to be managing that land, right? And what really concerns me is over the last year, we've had 100 million acres go under federal management now. 100 million acres of Alaska under federal management. Bureaucrats who don't share our values, that don't look at predator control like we do, who don't want to maximize the game. So I think a good first step is to do joint co-management with the state. I think that could actually be expanded into federal areas and displace the federal government because it doesn't share our values necessarily in some of those areas. I think that's a good first start. And it's also one that could potentially resolve the intractable issue with the state right now, but it's going to require a recognition of tribes, something that the state so far has been largely unwilling to do. So the co-management, it's not cooperation, it's not you do what I say, it's you have a choice at the table.
Thank you. And now we will provide each of you with a...
We got to finish that one.
Lisa, go ahead.
Oh, I'm sorry. All right. I do support a constitutional amendment which would overturn the McDowell decision and reinstate Alaska's ability to maintain a rural preference. And I have stated that for a long period of time. I think that what we need to be doing here in this state is everything that we can to bring management of our resources back to Alaskans. And this requires us as Alaskans to figure things out so that we can be united as we gain more control. We're seeing more and more decisions coming out of our federal agencies that are limiting our access and our ability to really have control of our resources. I appreciate what our Lieutenant Governor has been doing in leading the conversation on how we can do exactly this, how we can get to better management of our resources.
Yeah, state and federal law are in conflict, and therein lies the problem. I do favor rural subsistence preferences, and the settlement offers and proposals I've seen, what I would like to see is an order of preference. I think that Alaska's resources you need to go to the rural areas first, and those who are most dependent on it first. So from that point of view, I support rural subsistence. I also think that there are people throughout Alaska who like to enjoy a few salmon and so on and so forth. They should come second in order of priority. And I think that the commercial uses of our fish and game should be as local as possible. I'd like to see the profits go to Alaskans, not the Japanese.
I support amending the Constitution to provide for a rural preference, which would in turn allow for unified management. However, there has been little or no interest in putting a constitutional amendment on the ballot, and not much of a movement in the Alaska State Legislature to do so since 2002. As you all probably know, Section 801 of ANILCA contains a finding, and I'll just quote it, that the continuation of the opportunity for subsistence uses by rural residents of Alaska, including both natives and non-natives, on the public lands and by Alaska Natives on native lands is essential to native physical, economic, traditional, and cultural existence, and to non-native physical, economic, traditional, and social existence. And I think you can make a compelling argument that a people's cultural existence, gathering, bartering, sharing, is more important than non-native social existence. ANILCA treated both the same, but I think that we could look for an amendment to that to recognize the difference.
Thank you. And at this time, we will provide for 1 minute closing comments. And we will start with Ray Metcalfe.
I'm the person that you may remember went to the federal government and said, we are not getting what we should be for our oil, and bribery is the reason. You just heard about the state going broke. You also heard about the giant savings account that we're now draining down. That savings is a direct result of legislation passed after I helped put 6 legislators behind bars and 4 people who were bribing them behind bars. And for a short period of time, we were getting what we should for our oil. We saved up $16 billion, and now we're spending it down because it took 6 years for the oil companies to regain control of your legislature and your governor's office. So these are the kinds of things that I think are important. Corruption is killing the Alaska dream. Corruption is killing the American dream. If you want the person that's dedicated to fixing it, I'm your guy.
Thank you. Ms. Stock?
I'd like to talk a little bit about my underlying philosophy, which is what will inform my voting and my decisions on issues of importance to Alaska Native communities. First, we must protect the earth. This is an incredible creation from which we all derive sustenance. We must fully recognize the need to combine indigenous knowledge and wisdom with Western knowledge and wisdom before we reach a disastrous tipping point simply for our short-term greed. I'm running as an independent. That means I will put the needs of Alaskans and the needs of the United States before the needs of a partisan political party. Throughout my campaign, I've explained repeatedly that I do not support the national candidate of the Republican Party, Donald Trump. You are aware of his long list of disqualifying factors. He's repeatedly made derogatory comments about various groups, including Alaska Natives. I support Hillary Clinton, and I hope you will join me in welcoming her as the next president of the United States.
Thank you. Joe Miller?
I want to congratulate AFN on 50 years. The next 50 years is going to depend on the leadership that's in this room as well as future generations. And I think a strong rural Alaska with strong tribes, strong ANCs can create that. But let's not fool ourselves. I said this back in 2010, it's a shrinking federal pot. We all know that now in this room, don't we? I mean, the state government's up against the wall. Half our PFD gone. What does this tell us? It tells us that we've got to strike out in a new direction. It has to be transformative. Now, I'm all for protecting the earth. We have to do that, but we must extract wealth from the earth. We need to create jobs and purpose, something that we have the extraordinary ability to do here in Alaska. Our Creator has given us a gift. It's Alaska. He's given us purpose. We have the capacity to make Alaska unlike anything it's ever been. It could be not just an economic renaissance in Alaska, it could be an economic renaissance for the nation.
Thank you. And thank AFN for this opportunity to be with you and for bringing us together for this discussion. This is a significant time for our First Peoples in this state. We think about the transitions that we have talked about, where we go from here. We have extraordinary passion with our young people. We have extraordinary wisdom from those who have laid the path before us. We have opportunity, we have optimism. Yes, we have challenges. But through our indigenous peoples, through our Alaska Natives, you have led us as Alaskans. Think about the ways that you have pioneered, whether it's through our healthcare system, whether it's what you are doing as you are working to protect the land as the people with the true PhDs in living. Think about your contribution. I would be honored to have your vote November 8th.
Koyana, to all of you for participating in our candidates forum. We appreciate it very much. And for those of you that have not picked up a voter's guide, many questions were answered by the candidates and are available there in the voter's guide. And be sure to get out the vote next month, or early voting is happening now. Thank you.
Thank you.
We'll move on to the next panel of candidates.
Okay, we need to take my bookmark.